Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is another episode of American Alert. My name is Jan Hernik, and I'm editor in chief of the Warsaw Institute. Today, we are going to talk about the crisis on the Ukrainian border and Joe Biden's administration response to it. And today, my guest is Professor Clifford Angel Bates Jr., professor at the University of Warsaw and Norwich University. Welcome to American Alert.
Hi there.
Hello. Of course, we encourage you to ask questions to our guests during the entire talk today. And we are going to talk about Biden's approach to the crisis on Ukrainian border. So maybe the first question I will have to our guest will be about summing up the whole relationship between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin and their meetings in live in Geneva last year, and also these talks or calls, phone calls, which we observed last months and weeks.
Okay, I think the problem here is we have to talk about two different things here. If you want to talk about the Putin-Biden relationship, I think there's no such thing. There's no relationship in that sense. Biden, people kept away from Putin have always, we have to understand the Biden family and the Biden as a politician, as a political actor, as a Democratic senator, and also as vice president, and now as a candidate and then president. Biden was always kind of, at one level he was never interested in Putin or the Russians per se. I think we have to talk about Putin, the Biden-Putin relationship in light of Biden being the president now, and this has to do with the nature of the symbolic representation of Biden. What does he look like, and how does he act? And the problem here is the appearance of Biden projects, and basically, Mr. Poopy Pants, a senile dementia case who was made president because of hatred of Donald Trump by significant portions of the American elite and the American media and the American business industry. And a lot of voters too. No, but you can argue that the major Democratic machine was able to deliver their urban centers to Biden. And what's so interesting about this was how Biden won the presidency by being absent and having a media do all the work for him. So Biden is never in a situation where he's challenged or he is confronted. And when he is challenged or confronted, all the signs of early dementia. When he was challenged in the campaign by a couple of people, Biden threatened to take the guy out back and fight. I'm going to take you outside and fight you. He's coming across as senile old Uncle Bob or senile Uncle Grandpa. Now, imagine that, and this is Putin. Putin looks at this and says, this is great. This is like wonderful. Why? Because he's weak. I can take advantage of him. He doesn't know what he's not, he wants to look good. He wants to say something interesting and be somewhat attentive, but then he's just utterly weak. He doesn't, and he's being told, he's just reading instructions from his staff. His staff is governing him. I mean, this is the Wilson presidency 2.0. At the end of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, he was basically comatose, and Mrs. Wilson was running the country for the last few months of his presidency. And the problem is Biden is not comatose. He's just, the dotty old man who is given things to read by his staff.
All right, so owing to you, this is like what Vladimir Putin decided maybe to pose a threat to Ukraine because of Joe Biden's visible weakness?
No, the thing about this is there's multiple issues here. The victory in Germany by the Social Democrats in the last election. The Social Democrats are bought and paid for by Moscow because of the way much of the Social Democratic Party has been bought by Russian oligarchs or Russian industry in the past, and it's true now. In other words, the victory of the SDP in the German elections and the rise of the SDP chancellorship um, and the and basically Merkel's removal from being chancellor. This, I mean, her retirement from chancellorship, basically is a gift to Putin because Putin knows that Germany now, the left is in his case who will basically double down on Germany's economic energy dependence on Russia. And as that, this is something I would say. This is one aspect. This is one aspect of why Putin is taking this moment. And yes, the weakness of Biden, but the perception of Biden being weak and not being in charge, and the also the fact that we had the disaster, what happened in Afghanistan, that the Biden administration's handling of the withdrawal in Afghanistan was so bad, was a cluster. I don't want to use the F word, but it was and you can say, Trump got us in the agreement to withdraw, but Trump's agreement to withdraw had so many conditions and target things, and Trump's withdrawal plan had the transfer of Bagram, if at all, at the very end, not the first thing being done. So the way the administration handled it was so horrible. Not Trump, the Biden administration handled the withdrawal. In other words, it was all done for the sake of a photo op that American forces are withdrawn by September 1st. So by the anniversary of the September 11 event, 20 years after September 11, America was out. In other words, Biden was willing to sacrifice good operational activity for a photo op. And therefore, Putin sees this. And remember, Putin has used other people's desire for photo ops as an occasion to act. Remember in 2008 during the Chinese Olympics, Putin used that to invade Georgia. And this really pissed off the Chinese because the 2008 Olympics was supposed to be the showcase of China. And doing the invasion on the opening night of the event, that was, again, this is typical Putin. Putin will use, in other words, photo ops and see photo ops of other sides as an occasion. And therefore, he thinks, well, maybe I can get a repeat of Munich. Maybe I can see, we have to understand that what happened at Munich. Hitler wanted a war at Munich. Hitler left Munich with everything, but he was unhappy. Why? Because he didn't get a war. Now, Putin does not want a war. He can't afford it. I mean, in many ways, Putin is still suffering from the earlier invasion of Eastern Ukraine. See, this is one of the things people don't talk about. Was that how the Ukrainian militia didn't repel completely Russia, but stopped it and imposed huge, unacceptable casualties. People forget the fact that in the during the earlier attacks before I forget my date is slipping my mind, but before the Syrian operations, Putin had to bring in mobile cremating units to prevent the dead bodies of Russian soldiers being sent back home. Why? Because once the body bags start going back to the small towns in Russia, then all support his support will wither away.
Hmm.
So Putin doesn't. Putin knows that if he actually sends forces in, it won't go as smoothly as. In other words, Putin likes to project power and make everyone think he is more powerful. And again, this echoes perfectly what happened in Munich, because if the Allies let the Germans fight the Czechs in 38, the Czechs would have defeated the Germans, and the general staff would have cooed Hitler. So one of the greatest sins of Munich and international relations was how the Western powers sacrificed the sovereignty of of Czechoslovakia. In many ways, and this is
Hmm.
repeating it, and now this is repeating itself again in how the great powers, particularly the United States and Britain, has dealt with Ukraine. Because remember, ever since the 90s and the Bucharest Agreement, the British and the Americans committed themselves preserving the boundaries of Ukraine when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. Okay, so therefore, if America and Britain isn't going to honor its agreement, then perhaps they need to give Ukraine back their nuclear weapons.
Yes,
Okay,
because we know Joe Biden said that he will not send troops to Ukraine, right?
and that's a mistake.
But
No, no,
mhm.
but he said that, but honestly, he has no choice in the matter. This is another thing people don't realize. Um, the man running what's going right now, you're seeing 82nd Airborne come in Poland. You're seeing American military forces. You see the B-52s in Scotland. You see the flying over the Baltic. Biden has not made one of these decisions. This was all done by General Walter Sakor, the Supreme Commander of Europe. And people don't
Mhm.
realize that the NATO treaty that confirmed by the Senate and other states as a treaty authorizes the SECOR to command and control deploy and activate any NATO assigned unit without authorization of the leadership of the leaderships of the member states. So any up unit that's assigned to a NATO function, he can, if it's a reserve function, a reserve unit, whatever, if it's in the NATO TNOE, the SACOR, the Supreme Commander of Europe, has the operational authority to utilize them as he sees fit. And he only responds to the Secretary General of NATO. Not even though he's an American general, he does not at all have to take orders from Joe Biden. Why?
So you see the
Because
possibility of American soldiers fighting Russians on Ukrainian soil?
yes, in fact, I suspect this is the strategy of NATO, because NATO knows they
Mhm.
cannot. The Suwalki Gap is undefendable. In other words, you don't want to fight a war. If the Russians are going to come in, you have to do two things: remove Kaliningrad as a threat, neutralize Kaliningrad, and that can be done with conventional weapons, usually fire ordnance weapons and other things like this. Now, neutralizing Kaliningrad is stage one. And therefore, any NATO operation has that, because that's also neutralizing his mobile nukes. Because right now, most of the Russian mobile nukes in the European theater are in Kaliningrad. He's using them as theater intermediate range weapons to threaten the Europeans. He's been doing that for a decade now. So he has exposed his nuclear forces. We know where they are. The Western powers know where they are, and that and that's why he kind of wants to. He really wants to bring you us the real. I think the real integration moment is Belarus. I think in many ways he needs to bring Belarus under his complete control, because this is the only way he can directly link up with Kaliningrad. Because right now, the only way he can go directly, I mean, he has to as air supply and water supply his stuff, and has to transfer through another country. Lithuania and or Belarus. Now, this is not convenient for him. This is actually, in other words, he can't play around with this mobile nuke force. Therefore, he needs the freedom of Belarus or controlling Belarus to do that. So, in many ways, the West needs to start realizing that that he's maybe using Ukrainian tension as a front to deal something with Belarus, integrating or maybe merging Belarus into Moscow's operational control. And I think we see a little bit of that happening, and what happened with the antics at the border this winter. That I suspect if people, I don't know, I don't really have access to what the Polish intelligence services know, but my hunch is that these were not necessarily only Ukrainian special forces unit, but Russian special forces units who were integrating with the migrants and operating the lasers targeting the Polish border guards. I think this was a this was a pure Russian propaganda thing. That the only reason why the Belarusian regime let this happen is being so isolated by the West. In other words, that because of the sanctions on Belarus, because of the repression of the Belarusian regime, this kind of ironically, the Belarusian regime was always trying to kind of not be in bed with or controlled by Putin, but now he's forced to be controlled because there's no room for him to operate any other way. So therefore, this is a very strange moment. That at one level there's the appearance of weakness, and there's a very appearance of global weakness, both on the European front. That there's not Merkel around. There's no strong European leader who'd be willing to stand up against Putin. Macron is not that. Johnson is no longer in Europe in that sense. He's and Boris is a clown. He missed this interview he had with Morawiecki, where he said that line that like before we will stand with the Poles. In Poland didn't every Pole knows that in 1939 the Brits left you to rot, and then in 1944, 45 they left you to Stalin. So there is the kind of historical tone deafness that Boris Johnson revealed in his action. Now, this is typical Boris. Boris is not is a kind of very much of C student, as they say in Britain. He's a third. He's a playboy. He's a guy who gets off on his wits. So we can win a debate. He's a great debater. But then at the moment of real statesmanship, he, like what happened with his COVID response, he panicked. In other words, there's a moment where someone like, if I look at, and I think Putin is looking at what happened to Boris during COVID, how he first wanted to go one way, and then all of a sudden, when the hospital started to have the high raise in that 1-2 day window, he panicked. And that every time when he gets kind of panicky, he follows what his wife says, his latest wife, and her things, and forces cabinet changes, makes political changes, makes stupid decisions, and therefore we can say Johnson. I remember this is the problem, because remember it's the British and the Americans, not NATO, who guaranteed a Ukrainian situation. So, but why is NATO involved? NATO is involved only because of the threat to NATO members, and the threat is real to NATO members. At the Baltic states, any incursion in Ukraine will probably lead to a possible incursion or threats against the Baltic states, which, by the way, also includes uh, 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 the Finns, the Norwegians. The Norwegians are very much willing to start an oil agreement, gas agreement with the Poles and the Northern Europeans to kind of bypass Russia. And this is another aspect. This is something Putin wants to stop. Putin wants to stop any energy independence of the Baltic states and and Poland from Russia. So there's this Baltic. There's going to be pressure on the Baltics. There's going to be pressure on Poland. So therefore, the NATO commander doesn't want to fight. Doesn't really want to. If and also Poland cannot stop from Poland's security interest. Poland cannot handle if Kiev falls. If
So, in
Kiev
your opinion,
falls,
it is good and legitimate decision to bring another troops, American troops, to
yes,
Poland?
yes, because this is saying to Putin, if you go into Ukraine, you're starting a war. In other words, the Poles in the Baltic states cannot tolerate Kiev falling because of the and in fact, some people argue this is what we say is Putin's real plan. Putin really wants to grab Kiev and divide, partition Ukraine, Western Ukraine out of. He doesn't want Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine is full of fascists, old nationalists. Um, and that's where the heart of anti-Russian attitude is. So, and Kiev is kind of seen as the middle ground, and symbolically very important for Russian nationalism. So, if he could do is he could kind of offer a partition. I think this is Putin's kind of geopolitical strategy, saying, well, if he does go in there, he's gonna try that. Now, the Poles won't. I mean, honestly, no. This idea that you creating having the Western Ukrainians dumped in Poland will be the greatest geopolitical disaster from Poland's point of view. It will change everything. It will be a thorn in Poland's side in more ways than one. It will change the Polish domestic politics greatly because of the fact that Western Ukraine has very much anti-Polish settlements. The attitude of Western Ukraine is similar to Poland in the sense that as Poland has this distrust of Germany and Russia, well, Ukraine has this distrust of Poland as its former colonial master in Russia, right? So the Western Ukrainians have a very much problems dealing with this fact. In other words, so therefore, and they really want to keep Ukraine. The Western militias were some of the most powerful militias, and actually, it helped revitalize Ukrainian nationalism, even for ethnic Russians. And this is something people don't realize how strong the militias are. The militias in Ukraine are basically civil society groups. It's a bottom up movement. It's not artificial. And this is why I think many of the defense departments, General Milley's account that Moscow will get to Kiev in 72 hours is laughable. I mean, I'm sorry, Moscow didn't make that much distance from the border to Kiev. Moscow didn't make that move in the east at anything near that thing within 7 months. Okay, so this is in many sense I think a lose-lose situation because he's going to be fading partisan guerrillas who's been the past 2.5 years been trained by American special. There's already over 300 American, British, NATO, over at least 500 to 700 of advisors, mostly special forces advisors, in Ukraine already. There's Americans already in Ukraine.
Mhm. And
And
Professor,
these
another
are,
question I will have to you. Sorry, I interrupted,
okay.
but I think it's kind of a similar topic, which is linked to what you said, because we heard that U.S. intelligence said that the attack will be today, 16th of February, but nothing happened right now still. So I would like to ask you about those these analysis, and do you think
It depends.
they are
Russia,
more
Moscow.
cheap propaganda, or
No,
maybe there
no. The
is
problem
something
here is
in
there's a
this?
double-sided effect here. One thing it is, you have okay. The NSA is good at signals intelligence. Okay, if it's signal intelligence, America has always been very good at signal intelligence. They got this from the British. This was Ultra in Britain and Magic in the U.S. Signal ops has been always one of the strong suits of the intelligence community, particularly that's why the NSA. However, analysis at the CIA has always been a disaster. In fact, there's an old joke a professor I studied about used to joke about the CIA. You could always know something was a CIA operation because everyone but the sub target was dead. Okay, the CIA is basically a very much been wrong about everything. In fact, anyone who's serious about fixing American intelligence for the past 30 years have been critical of the CIA. More than that, 40 years. It's been the CIA has been in need of reform, if not reform, total reform, because the nature of American intelligence is a complete crazy thing because it's multi-headed monster because of the way appropriations work in creation. In other words, the intelligence, so many. It's like we joke in this. Anyone who studies intelligence operations, but organizations in the United States, there's not just one or two or three. There's hundreds, over 280 different budgetary independent agencies of the federal government that deal with intelligence, military, foreign intelligence, or things that deal with like Atomic Energy Commission, the Energy Department, the Transportation Department, you name it. All these different federal departments will have intelligence agencies that get financed under the budget. And this creates this hydra, this uncreated, and that's one of the crises of that happened in September 11, where that and because of the Cold War, during in one of the responses to the anti-McCarthy period and the use of the FBI and the CIA wiretapping everyone and CONTELPRO and that stuff, and the cooperation between this, there was always a kind of a wall between CIA and FBI. The rule was CIA could operate abroad, FBI could operate domestically. But ironically, during World War II, the FBI operated all Latin America. The old OSS, the thing that came before the CIA, had no rights to operate in Latin America. So when the CIA came up and got over Latin American jurisdiction, often they had to basically rely and cooperate with older FBI operations. But if you look at the record of the CIA, it's been an outright disaster as an agency. In fact, this is the irony: if intelligence services were really the mechanism to win wars, then the Soviets would have won the Cold War. In fact, in spite of the excellence, the superiority of KGB, the Russians lost the Cold War, not because of because the KGB was bad or the FBI and CIA was good. The FBI and CIA were mostly incompetent, and only had breaks when Moscow was in chaos. So one of the most important lessons here is in fact, even this is the lesson that everyone doesn't walk away with during the war on terror, is how bad the intelligence agencies were. Their record is a disaster. I mean, the best thing. I mean, one of the mechanisms that the only successful operations the intelligence communities were doing was kind of similar to what happened regarding Governor Whitmer. What happened with the FBI using infiltrating agents to militia groups to convince a bunch of a couple of militia people to attempt to kidnap Governor Whitmer. Well, that was the standard playbook of a targeting jihadist. They would find in other words, they would go out into the Islamic neighborhoods, find a kooky person, radicalize him, get him to do something, and then arrest him and say, "Oh, we stopped the war." I mean, this was a standard attempt of the intelligence bureaucracy to justify their budget.
Mm-hmm.
This was the scandal of the code. In other words, in order to justify, if you're, in other words, the budgetary wars and competition for money led the different agencies to deliver things and deliver arrests and things to justify their budgets. And what happened with the FBI and the CIA was these attempts to create incidents. And now that those tactics that they used during the war on terror are now being unleashed on domestic populations in the U.S.
Right. So, in your opinion, where should we search for some reliable sources in terms of what's going on in Ukraine, and if the war
There's
will
lots
break
of
out?
stuff in the. I mean, the media. See, the Russians are also flooding disinformation to confuse people. And I think what's
But this
happening
was
is
American intelligence.
no, but I think they're feeding. I mean, it's come on. American intelligence are basically having specialists or people listening and staff at the embassy listening to what's going on. So you don't think I'm Moscow? I know who they are. I'm going to make sure that they're fed information. I mean, that's how it's operating. This is. I mean, what's happening here is you have a bunch of millennial idiots who are recruited into the Biden and Obama CIA, who are educated at American elite universities. Therefore, they're nincompoops. They're morons to the great degree. You have a college degree from an elite university. That means you're basically have the. I mean, people get dumber going to school in the U.S. It's harder getting into Harvard, and people, it's harder to get into most of these schools than graduate from these schools. And a lot of these kids don't have to do anything. And then what happens is they graduate from elite universities, and they get jobs in the government or in the intelligence services and things like this. And this is where many of the people you see now are basically the recruits of the Obama era, who are now into the middle level management of these agencies. And therefore, instead of what Trump should have done was purge them. Trump's failure to deal with the administrative rot of 30 years of malfeasance in the intelligence and military. And I think this is because he trusted them to a degree in ways he shouldn't have. And also he didn't really know how to work. He didn't know about the kind of retail politics and the necessary of doing things. And plus there wasn't enough experts and specialists he could bring in, and it would just require too much work. In other words, and Trump didn't really have, he didn't want to play rough. No matter what Trump's perception of him and being a tough guy, he was a softie. And I think this is the mistake of Trump in that sense. The mistake of everyone the Europeans should have embraced Trump, because in many ways he gave them the opportunity to, because what's going to come after Trump on the right is going to be much worse and much less forgiving. And I think this is the reality, particularly towards Europe. And I think this is the problem here. The Russians are feeding the American idiots the information. They're falling for it. And you have to also understand that Biden and as vice president in charge of Ukraine under Obama had made for himself very strong connections and certain industry ties, and he was able to bully things. And what we see now in many
Also through
developed,
his son, right?
well, not only through his son, yes, the son and the son was the means the money came through, but it wasn't necessary
Mhm.
how Biden was using his role as the special envoy, and I mean, to degrees he was using his office to influence Ukraine policy, and I think this is continued. Not necessarily. You have to remember, as the vice president, he had staff. Those people who had staff jobs under him, like Victoria Nolan, who was the son, who was the wife of Kagan, the so-called neoconservative. Kagan and Nolan are neoconservatives, but they worked in the Obama administration and worked with her role as special advisor to operations in Ukraine, reported to Biden, not to Secretary of State Hillary. So we forget about that. The staff people who had connections to Biden, the way that they operated with that.
And Professor, if we talk about Joe Biden, yesterday he had a speech with updates. If we talk about this U.S.-Russian relations and Ukraine, and some of the experts or journalists, especially leftist journalists, let's call it like that, they called this speech as saving Europe speech because Biden said, quote, the United States is prepared no matter what happens, and another quote, make no mistake, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the opinion of these experts and journalists was like this stopped Putin. How do you assess such information, such opinion?
No, this doesn't stop Putin. Putin understands that this is just words, but it's
Mhm.
Biden. If this was Trump and not Biden, Biden just reads what's in front of him.
Mhm.
Trump goes off and says things on his own. Biden can't make a decision. He literally can't. And if he does make a decision, it's going to be one of a dementia case. He's going to react in a kind of irrational manner. No matter what you want to say about Trump, you might hate him, you might dislike him, you might think he's vulgar and he's crass and he's politically incorrect. And you might even think he was not necessarily, having the right opinions about things. But my God, when he was able to bully and threaten in ways effectively. I mean, his handling of events like in Syria and in Iran, about how he targeted individuals, and then he wouldn't over. In other words, he was using force in a way that was believable that there would be retaliation, and everyone was so afraid of him that he would go crazy. I mean, remember one of the things people don't remember. One of the first things Trump talked with his military men about as president was nuclear forces, and this scared everyone. This was widely reported, saying Trump asked, "Well, why couldn't we use them?" Uh, um, and this was reported as, "Oh my God, he's unstable." Well, I'm sorry. I don't know about you, but if you I think that was an intentional act on his part to knowing that the media would hyperventilate that and spread it globally. Now, if you're Moscow, Iran, China, a power, and you think that the media is telling you that this guy's might use a nuclear weapon if you do something, what happened here? In economic games, you've made the cost of acting too high. You don't know. You don't know whether he's going to pull the trigger or not. You don't know is he going to
Mhm.
bomb you or not. You don't know he's going to get angry and do something, right? So the cost of an action is so high. Biden is in a weird situation. See, Biden is a situation where his rhetoric is all rhetoric. It's all talk, and like Obama in that sense. Remember Obama's red line in Syria, a red line. But then what happened when it was crossed? You know, then you don't get believed. The failure to defend Crimea in complete violation of the Bucharest Agreement. A failure to act immediately then to repel by Putin by the Obama administration and the British was it was basically saying, it basically said to the whole world, you can't rely on America to uphold the bilateral agreements. So what happened? And remember, what was that bilateral agreement about? The Bucharest Agreement. It was nuclear proliferation. So what happened? Immediately after the failure of the Obama administration to uphold the nuclear proliferation regime, what happened? All of a sudden, everyone and their mother started developing nuclear weapons. Right now, we are not only the Iranians, but the Saudis are under. The Saudis are probably have a nuclear weapon right now. I think the Saudis will be very quickly building a nuclear weapon. Not only the Pakistanis and the Indians, but also you have the North Koreans advancing. I mean, the North Koreans were afraid of Trump in many ways. Now they're not afraid of Biden. They're not afraid of the liberals because they know the liberals only talk. Trump was able to make the advantage of that. Now there was a stop there, because what happened was that Trump couldn't make any real move because North Korea is too dependent upon China, economically and geopolitically, and that if he tried making a move, the Chinese couldn't tolerate that. So the purpose, remember, for China, the purpose of keeping North Korea alive is to ensure that there's no unified Korea, because a unified Korea will be the biggest threat to China geopolitically. So, in many ways, the fool Trump knew that better than many of the experts at State Department and these places. So, again, this is an example of the so-called experts, the so-called wonder boys of Georgetown, Harvard, Kennedy School, being completely wrong. Like they were wrong about the Cold War, as they were wrong about the war on terror, wrong about development in both Iraq and in Afghanistan. The record of the academic and policy experts on these things are dismal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at even the record about what happened with COVID projections by the experts on, the beginning of the COVID scandal, that the COVID trajectories were simply just the LSE, London School of Economics numbers were so off. Because why? The experts are not experts. They have a pretense of expertise, which has been allowed to get influence policy to great degrees. And I think this is the problem here, that many of these so-called experts are get jobs at McKinsey and the consulting firms, who then get look at Buttigieg, Mayor.
Secretary of Transportation, right?
Yeah. I mean, he was a mayor of a college town. Okay. But before that, yes, he was in the military, but he was also he was only a consultant. He never had any real expertise, real jobs, real knowledge. He was a typical millennial elite out of the elite universities who punched his ticket in a certain way and has a nice multicultural narrative. He's gay. He's not. He's a gay guy. So
therefore, he fits perfectly to Biden administration, right?
Yes, yes. No. The kind of submission to the SJW woke peace. In other words, Biden basically made peace in order to get elected. He made peace with the social justice BLM left.
Hmm.
And what happened was that they became they and all those young millennial Democrats who were basically like this took over his department, who were sympathetic to Bernie Sanders, ultimately came and took over his administration because he had nothing. He inherited Obama's team. And what happened is that he's not in charge. His staff runs things. And actually, this is good in one sense. The fact that NATO operations are not being controlled at all, really by either his team or him, but by Sakor, by General Waller in that sense. I
Hmm.
would be more. I'm very. I sleep at night. I'm able to. I mean, people who are saying, "Oh, don't you trust?" The problem here is the mistake Putin may make is Putin may think Biden is responsible. So we might get a war only because Moscow thinks Biden and these guys are really in charge, but the guy is in charge is really this general. And that if anything is done and anything is crossed, remember, Poland can set this war off also. If all of a sudden Russians and for some reason po- uh, 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 Russian forces attack Polish support units or support, remember
Hmm.
how much the Polish military is in Ukraine training people. You might get a incident where NATO has to go into Ukraine to protect the the support troops. Okay, so therefore, and therefore, he's. I think Zuckerberg is doing everything he can to send a very clear signal that the cost of doing anything is a war, and it's a
Yeah, and
failure.
I would like to talk about the signals because you already mentioned State Department in our talk, also Biden administration, Biden's team, which makes decisions. And I wanted to ask you about the narrative. You call it like liberal narrative in diplomacy, which is only talk, talk, and talk. So I wanted to ask you because Anthony Blinken, I remember he has been using this since the beginning of these talks. He always said that the US is ready for swift and severe consequences. I quote it. He says this all the time. But he has never gave any specific
Oh,
ways
because he's an idiot. Because he's no, no. I
by
mean,
which
just
US
look.
will react, right? And I wanted
No,
to
the
ask
problem with
you, do they have
can I
any actual response plan, or do they just talk, 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 and talk, right?
see? This is a case where the right hand may not know what the left hand is doing. Blinken is a perfect example of a complete,
Hmm.
uh, an intellectual yet an idiot. Taleb's famous IYI. He's well educated, but he's a complete dithering idiot. And I will say this because look at his behavior. In other words, he cannot. He's so controlled. He doesn't always have. He has talking points, but he doesn't give you supporting evidence or answers.
Hmm.
And this happened in the DoD. This was a very interesting case a couple of weeks ago where a Reuters reporter humiliated the I think it was the Defense Department spokesperson, where
Okay.
the spokesperson made claims that there's going to be a false flag operation by Russia. So he said, well, "Okay, what's the evidence for that?" And he says, "Well, we told you that the evidence is our claim." I said, "No, that's a claim. That's not evidence." Okay, and that went on for like 10, 20 minutes, and then and all of a sudden it led to a point where, well, if you're supporting Putin by saying this, okay, now this kind of this level of incompetence,
Hmm.
utter incompetence, where you have, and this is a problem of much of what we call the post Gen X, from Gen X to the millennials, who went to the elite universities, who entered civil service. There is this culture of arrogance and entitlement and belief that they know something, but if you push them, try to say, "Oh, support your argument. Give me evidence to." So you're saying this. Well, what's your evidence? Well, they don't know the evidence. They didn't bother looking up the evidence. They came to a press conference not having the actual evidence, but only the talking points. Okay, and you can't do that as a real policy person. I mean, you have to be able to. Blinken's mistake here, and this is Obama's mistake also, was if you're going to threaten, you have to be credible. If people don't
Mhm.
believe, if you people don't believe you're credible, therefore, if you're going to threaten, you better say, "Oh, we're going to be a response." Well, you better show, and someone's going to ask you, "What is that response?" You better say, "Well, this is we're going to. The NATO commander has operational authority in this matter. Please contact the NATO commander. He will sack." In other words, what Blinken should have done is immediately redirected all questions to Sackler. But if they do that, they show that the emperor has no clothes. See, this is the problem. Right now, much of Joe Biden has no clothes. I mean, the presidential system has the myth of the president being in charge, that he's the man in charge, right? That's the whole idea of this idea of the presidency. But the problem here is that, well, he's not in charge. The civil servants and the administrators are in charge. I mean, what we have here is the classic case of what the BBC comedy of the 70s and 80s, Yes Minister, perfectly demonstrated. The tension between governmental ministers and the civil service. That ministers who are elected by democratic governments often have agendas that tied to democratic legitimacy, and the permanent civil service, or which is in American parlance these days among the certain circles of the right, to deep state, um, have an interest of their own, a long-term interest of their own. This is what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, right? This is these civil service positions, these positions in the permanent military and the permanent civil service have a certain relationships with industry and in government sectors. I mean, come on, look what happened to the previous SECOR. After, in other words, after your SACOR, what happens? You're not going to be Joint Chief of Staff if you did something to piss off the president or a president. You're not going to be moved up the chain of. You're not going to get a new promotion. I mean, you're a 4-star general already. You're not going to get anything more. So the only thing left is Joint Chief of Staff, or maybe the service head. But why would you want that? It's not really. Maybe Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but that's not really that great either. You might as well just retire. You got the height of your career service. And therefore, what did General Bedlia? Remember, what's happening with Wohler now is a repeat of what happened in 2015, 2016, where Moscow was making similar moves. And General Bedlia, an Air Force general, moved NATO forces similarly without. Obama was simply just not. He was AWOL. He was just not involved. Bedliev moved NATO forces, moved the B-52s, very similar moves as what's happening now. And what happened after his term ended? Well, he got a job at the Atlantic Council. So if Bedliev's term is up, when Bedliev's term's up, I think it will be up, and he got in 2019. So, no, I mean, Wohler's term's up. Wohler entered 2019, so I suspect he will be probably gone in 22. 24. And I'm actually worried about that because Biden will pick the replacement, and if he picks woke replacement, this will be a disaster for NATO. So in many ways, everyone should be hoping Wohler stays on for the remainder of Biden's term. But that's not likely in that sense. It could happen. they're not set terms. So I'm a little worried about that. But the adults are in charge. People like General Waller. I'm probably saying his name. I always do. I always get names a little off. Please forgive me for that. But the NATO commander, Supreme Commander of Europe, he and his staff are the adults. They're running this. And in many ways, the Schomburg, the NATO Secretary General, is a rather sane. He has support, widespread support. He's not going to. He's not going to risk challenging Waller in that sense. In other words, political NATO has never really ever challenged military NATO. So I'm looking at this from that point of view and saying, well, what's happening here? What's happening here is Biden is run by his staff, but his staff are the DNC Obama staff who don't have any knowledge of these things. Whereas the people really running the show is the permanent people at NATO who do have understandings of these things. And right now, many of the senior military people in NATO are Poles. The Poles have, because of the relationship the Polish military has had with the American military and the British military during the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, many mid-level positions in NATO are being filled by Poles, who used to be filled by Germans. But because Germany does not have the combat units and combat operational experience that the Poles have had past 20 years, now Polish officers are much more integrated in these NATO operational activities. And this is across board. Remember, this is not only the Army. This is Army, Air Force, and Navy. All across the board, both in normal combat, military combat, and special operations. All under this. And I think this is the problem. I think NATO, in this sense, is not as endangered at the operational level as people want to say it is at the political level. Yes, you have the problem of the Turks. Yes, you have the problems of this. But as long as you have Secor, who can take, in other words, in other words, any NATO operational unit that has authority, he can move it. That's the treaty. So if what's his name in Turkey, the Turkish president, if he refuses Erdogan, if Secor orders Turkish units to come into there, Erdogan can't. He'd have to break get Turkey out of NATO. He would have to breach the treaty. Because right now, NATO the military is under. In other words, any Turkish unit that is assigned NATO operational activities, the treaty specifically authorizes the Secor to control. And this is a case
Professor, I would like to ask you. I would like to ask you about another liberal ruling to the north of from the Washington D.C. I mean Justin Trudeau, because we talked before the recording about the weakness also in his administration, in his policy, because of course it was embodied by the truck protests in Ottawa. So I would like to ask you about your opinion and your projection, perception of his weakness, in his policy.
Well, okay. Trudeau is already weak because he's a minority government. I mean, his party was the second place party in the last election, but it was only able to remain in power because of a coalition with National Democrats. Okay, the left, the Democratic left, and therefore he has a minority government. And like any minority government, the irony here is that the trucker rebellion is a working class rebellion. It is really a workers' proletarian uprising. And this is going to the coalition partner, the National Democrats. Their position here is very problematic because they're a socialist party, and therefore it's very hard to be a socialist party and to be against the workers. Okay, but that's the problem with modern socialism. Modern socialism has nothing to do with workers. It has to do more with gender identity and race identity these days. And for NDP, this is more about multiculturalism and tying to the Asian populations in the Western, like British Columbia, and or those Western Indian populations in Ottawa and elsewhere. So you have weird situation in this situation. That, in other words, if and actually the problem with the Liberal parties, there's enough members of the Liberal Party because Quebec is now favoring. The heart of the Liberal Party always relied on Quebec support, and that's why Trudeau is a French name, right? He's from Quebec sector, but he represents the Liberal Party. His father represented the Liberal Party against the Quebecois, and it's his father who embraced multiculturalism as a way to fight the Quebecois separatism. So the Quebecois bloc is right now openly against him. Okay, and if the next election, I suspect conservatives in the Quebecois will purge Quebec. The Liberals might lose Quebec. If that happens, the Liberals become a minority party. It becomes they won't have enough to even. So the danger here is the question of these backbenchers in the Liberal Party, and they're looking at the future. They're saying, in the next election, are we going to be punished for what Trudeau has done here? Will Trudeau be so demonized? We have to remember what he's done here. It's not just he hasn't done any. He reacted poorly, wouldn't talk to the truckers. What he's done this a day or so ago was declare a state of emergency, like Jaruzelski did in 1980, 81, right? The national state of war, domestic state of war. He's released the state of emergency grants him absolute the right to not be accountable to Canadian law. In other words, he has dictatorial powers in the Roman law sense. His dictatorship under that's what the emergency powers decree is. It's giving the prime minister dictatorial powers, and he's supposed to only do this when a severe sovereignty, Canada's sovereignty, is threatened, or the national something disaster or something that requires this. That this is being done because of these truckers is farcical. So therefore, that he has to now, as someone said, use sledgehammers against gnats. This might actually lead. Remember, this is a parliamentary government. So if 20% of the Liberal Party backbenchers go to the Conservatives and say, we will support a no confidence vote or move for election, game's over. So, see, the problem here is he cannot see what he has done is he so demonized the truckers. He made it impossible for him to make any deal with them. He couldn't even go. In other words, his rhetoric made it impossible for him to do any practical move. So therefore, he couldn't go to the truckers. He couldn't do. A simple thing he could have done was he could have just ended the mandates like most European countries have been doing, and ended it. But no, because
he escaped from them. In fact, he escaped from them. I remember.
No, not escape. Fled.
Yeah, he got a positive COVID-19 test, right?
In a move that echoed the helicopter flight of Ceausescu. Ceausescu gave that speech and everyone booed him, and his people got in the helicopter and they flew out of the rest of the resort, right? We're having, Justin Trudeau is having a Ceausescu moment. The difference is, as Karl Marx said, history just tends to repeat itself. First time is tragedy, second time is farce. So what's going to happen is not Trudeau won't get executed. He will get humiliated and laughed out of office. I suspect what's going to happen is that there's going to be overreaction. There's going to be police attack, arresting old people. The problem here is the media. The media is the Canadian state media is basically Pravda on steroids. And the free independent media is no better. People, I know left wingers in Poland complain about TVP, right? About how it's controlled by PIS, right? That's always the case. State-owned media is always controlled by the government. But you don't have the control over the private media here, which is very critical of the government in ways that is not true in Canada. So what's happening in Canada is a real problem that many people don't know, and that people, if they're relying on the media, so therefore there needs to, if there's violence and the violence is caused by the police, what you had was the police chief of police in Ontario resign over this. If more military people resign on this might actually cause chaos. And this may force his own party to abandon him, and I think that is the way it's going to happen. I think they, at a certain point, the cost he's incurring to future electoral chances of the Liberal Party are as the atrocities increase. In other words, the second. He's basically, what is he doing? The truckers have nothing to gain. They're not, the fact that they're doing these protests is hurting themselves. So therefore, they're not doing this for money. He's threatening them, their bank accounts. He's seizing bank accounts.
Yes.
He's going to threaten their trucks. When you put people who have nothing to lose in a situation where they're really forcing them, that this is the recipe for violence. He is trying to create a violent incident, which will then allow him to use the military or the police as this. And I think what's going to happen
is also cause a transition of blame from him to them, like they are worse,
yes.
They are demonized.
Yes, and what I think, however, this is not going to happen that way. I think what's going to happen is they're going to be told that. I think the Canadian people, these truckers and these things, put me in jail. Okay, put me in jail. Great. Take me away. Put it so I can, and that therefore what's going to happen is this. I don't think there will be the violence that Trudeau wants and needs. I think what's going to happen is that the violence will be all done by the police. And right now in Canada, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, not a right-wing group, they came out against the decree and a lot of the actions, the seizing of money in the banks and other things. And remember, under the law, he has to go to Parliament, and he's refusing to do this. In other words, he was supposed to go to Parliament 2 days after the decree. And when he did, he refused to talk about it. And if you watch the parliamentary debates, it's amazing because he gives the same canned response. He never answers the opposition questions. He and his team, he stays there for certain questions, then he runs away, and then his minister for public safety takes over, or the health minister, and who just stand up for him. Now, what's so interesting is how white male they are. It's the white male liberal regime, which I think many, that it's very funny that the liberal woke, the real stormtroopers of the liberal woke are these liberal men, white men, who wear blackface, as Terrell did, who are racist and sexist in their own attitudes, but they embrace a politics of wokeness as a kind of cover or makeup for their own homophobia, racism, or something like that. It's kind of a need to they over exaggerate their left wing positions in order to kind of mask the reality of their privilege and their own homogeneity. So that's, I
So
mean,
we
Trudeau
will.
is an example of complete
Mhm.
weakness in that sense.
Yes,
He
we
is
will have
he is
another episode on that, I guess, Professor. So, unfortunately, our time is up right now.
okay. I,
But we would like to invite you to another episode, of course. Maybe we will organize some debate about Canada and the situation there, about what you introduced our viewers to right now. But for now, our time is up, as I said. So thank you so much, Professor Bates, for your time and expertise.
you're welcome.
Thank you also to our viewers. Thanks so much for watching another episode of American Alert. My name is Jan Hernik, editor in chief. So thank you for your attention. Thank you to our patrons. So we encourage you to subscribe to Warsaw Institute YouTube channel, find our Facebook, Twitter, social media accounts. So see you in the next episode.